Well, it all started with this 8x8 piece of oak. It was sitting in the side of my shop, telling me daily, "Mark, make me into something cool." And I told it, "Stop, I've got other stuff to do, leave me alone." And it whispered until it finally yelled, and I gave in and decided to make it into something cool. So let's get started. Because this piece was so big and heavy and awkward, I decided to cut it about in half so I can handle it a little bit better. My intention is to resaw this, and after a lot of grunting and groaning from me and my bandsaw, I managed to cut this into 1 3/4 inch slabs. I thought I had my bandsaw tuned well, but I still struggled with straight cuts on this big heavy board. So after some time on a joiner and a planer, I managed to come up with this stack of oak boards that are about 1.5 inches thick. Then I headed back over to the joiner to square up one edge at 90 degrees. I used the jointer earlier to flatten one side, and then ran it through the planer to get 2 parallel sides. Now I've got 3 parallel and square sides, and it's ready to head over to the table saw. I set up the table saw at 1.5 inch wide cut and started ripping these boards into thinner strips. Bing, bang, boom, and after that I've got a pile of 1.5 inch square strips, which I then cut in totally random lengths. With that done, it's time to start building a form out of some melamine. And I don't have a track saw yet, that's still on my wish list, maybe someday, but a straight edge for now works just fine, and I cut this board down to length. The melamine I had wasn't quite wide enough, so I'm adding a thin strip to one side to get it to the correct width. And to make this an official YouTube woodworking tutorial, I'm pulling out the pocket hole jig. Well, because pocket hole jigs are awesome. Ask any other YouTuber. Then I cut some 2.5 inch wide strips, and using a pile of screws and a countersink, I made sides for my form. After about 20 minutes and 2 rolls of blue box tape, my form is complete and ready to go. After that, I dry fitted the boards into the form. I just put them in a pretty much random formation. I wasn't sure if the strips I cut was going to be enough to fill the form, but it turned out to be just about right, so my guess was good on that. Then it was time to start mixing epoxy. It's like chemistry class for woodworkers. All that's missing is a big ridiculous pair of goggles. I mixed up about a quart, and after a whole bunch of stirring and stirring and stirring, it was ready to pour. I poured the goopy snot in the bottom of the form and spread it out, and then spaced all the boards in a completely random, different way than I started from the last time because, well, I couldn't remember how I did it. But it still worked out. Then I poured the rest of the epoxy on top of the boards and in between them. This was to glue them together and seal them for the next step. I actually didn't record that part because I had epoxy all over my gloves and didn't want to touch the record button. But you didn't miss much because it just looked like a bigger, goofier version of me finger painting in kindergarten. After the epoxy was cured and everything was set in place, it was time to start mixing up a bunch of different colors of epoxy to fill all the gaps. It took way more epoxy than I thought, about 2.5 gallons, believe it or not. I ended up pouring a lot of this epoxy after work, so it took me 2 or 3 days. But after that, I finally had a big, uneven mess for all my efforts. After another day and the epoxy was set, I knocked off the form, peeled off all the blue tape, and wow, it's starting to look like I know what I'm doing. But don't be fooled, I'm just making this up as I go. At this point, it's 32 inches wide and 60 inches long. It's just way too big and heavy to try to send through a planer, and I don't have one that big anyhow. So I reused the base of my mold, made it a little wider, added some sides, and turned it into a router sled. It was the easiest way I could think of to flatten this thing back out and clean all the epoxy mess off the top. As you can see, it made an enormous mess, but it did a good job of getting all the epoxy blobs off and flattening the slab back out. So with that done, and a whole bunch of sanding, it's ready to put some epoxy on. Wait, didn't he just take all the epoxy off, and now he's putting it back on? Yeah. So because this is such a big slab, I was a little bit worried about expansion and contraction with humidity changes. So I'm encapsulating the whole thing to try to prevent moisture changes in the content of the wood. and then an electric hand plane made quick work of flattening the edges back out. With the top generally prepped, it's time to start making the base and the legs for the desk. For this, I'm using ash. It's the same process of flattening, planing, and jointing the edges to prep the boards. And because I didn't have any 8/4 stock, and for those of you who don't know, 8/4 is, well, 8/4 of an inch, which actually equals 2 inches. So I'm gluing two 1-inch boards together to make some 2x2 ash legs. While it takes a little bit longer to do this, it's really not that big of a pain in the ash. So a little bit of glue and a bunch of clamps, and I can set the legs aside and move on to the next part. So with some more ash, I made some 2 3/4 inch wide boards. These will be the rails that go under the table. I'm cutting a dado to receive a piece of hardboard that'll act as a false bottom. Then I remembered that the false bottom potentially may need to come off in the future to access the lights, so I ended up cutting the dados into rabbets on 3 out of the 4 rails. Then back to the super awesome pocket hole jig, and I cut a bunch of pocket holes in these boards. I plan on using epoxy to adhere the boards to the bottom of the desk, and the only way I'm going to keep these boards in position while the epoxy sets is to screw them to the bottom of the desk. And between the screws and the epoxy, this thing should be rock solid. Well, now the legs are all done, and I'm ready to start putting this thing together. Wait, what? Why are the legs so short? Well, that's because this is for a really short person. Or maybe I just cut some 2x2 squares to use as spacers so I can set the rails up. You choose. You're just going to have to wait and see. Screwing these into the accurate position with epoxy on the bottom was just a tad bit awkward. It was a little bit like trying to pin down a greased pig at the county fair, but I came out the victor in the end, and I probably should have got a ribbon. This desk is actually a computer/gaming desk for my son who will be going off to college this fall, so I had to engineer it so the legs were removable to more easily transport it. To do this, I cut some small blocks with 45-degree angles on both ends. Here, I'm drilling some holes for some threaded bolt inserts. Then I used my pocket hole jig drill to drill some pilot holes so that I could screw the blocks into the rails. I really should have made a jig to do this a lot safer, and there's no excuse, so don't try this at home. I then pounded in the inserts, and these things are ready to install. A little bit of glue and a few pocket hole screws, and this thing's starting to come together. It's looking a little bit like a desk. This thing is a lot heavier than I anticipated, but it is solid. So it's the next day, and the actual legs that aren't 3 inches long are done. I'm going to true them up on the jointer and the table saw, and then cut them to their final length. For the next step, I need to cut a flat on about 3 inches of the top of one corner of a leg. In order to do this, the only way I could think of was to make a jig, something I should have done earlier on the corner brackets. But this time I did make a jig. This flat will be where the bolt holes go through and the legs attach to the bottom of the table. To make this flat, I'm using the router table and the jig and a 1/2-inch router bit. I'll slowly bump the fence over, taking just a little bit at a time until the flat is large enough to receive the bolts. As it turned out, it paid off a second time making the jig. It worked perfect to cut holes from corner to corner at the top of the leg. I had a piece of white beadboard that I trimmed to size. I figured this would reflect the light around the inside of the boxed in part of the table and help illuminate the whole underside. Then I just set it in place and marked the corners and trimmed it to size with a pull saw. Then I set it in place to test the fit, and then it was time to flip it over and start installing the light strips. I got the set from Amazon. It's two 16-foot strips that came in a set. I tried to pick the one that just had the least amount of negative reviews and hope for the best. I drew some lines on the board to evenly space the lights across the bottom. Then I used some 90-degree connectors to turn the corners and just started sticking this stuff down. I was a little worried about the 90-degree connectors, whether they'd work or not, but once I had that side stuck down, I plugged it in and tried it out, and what do you know, it worked. So I mirrored that same layout on the other side. With that part done, I was able to bolt on the legs and then flip the bottom over, making sure to plug in the connectors, and then screwed it down. I used screws to attach the bottom, that way it would be easy to access it if I ever needed to get in there and do any repairs on the lights or something. It would have been a lot smarter and easier if I asked somebody to come help me flip it over. It was pretty heavy and awkward, but I ungracefully managed to flip it over myself. After some small gap filling, I sanded, and then I sanded some more. I spared you the torture of watching me sand for hours and just cut that part out. But now it's finally ready and I'm applying some finish. And then the moment we've all been waiting for. I turned it on and wow, it actually worked and looked halfway decent. I love it when a plan comes together. It was a little bit more work than I anticipated, but in the end it turned out, and I was pretty happy with it. And my son, he really likes it, and that's the important part. So I would love to know what you think of this one in the comments section. I do read them. Please let me know. Thanks. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.